So we're in an engine room now, and I've got the Austin engine here. I'm just going to take all the ancillary parts off before we can actually get into there. I'm going to take the cylinder head off to check out the state of the bores, which is one important point, but also we've got that leak from the rear crankshaft seal, and I need to really investigate that. I don't know what I'm going to find in there yet. Okay, so right, there's the fan off. Comes in two parts, quite nice. So these are all British Standard Fine and British Standard Whitworth fixings. Whitworth's interesting because it was the first standardised thread size. Until that time, which was probably the 1830s maybe, or 1840s, if people made bolts or screws, they used their own thread pitch. But Whitworth came along and said, well, that's no good because we can't interchange these nuts and bolts. So I'm going to make a standardised thread size, and that's what he did. Famous guy. Using plenty of lubrication on all of the bolts and nuts because I may well have to use them again. One thing I'm making sure of is that all the fixings that I take off, if I keep them together, I'll know which bolt went with which part, which makes it much easier when I put it all back together again. But as you can see, everything's really red rusty. Right, now I can take the dynamo off. Sounds a little bit notchy in there. I'll probably send that off for a rebuild, at least to get it checked anyway. Right, there we go. Nice and rusty in there. Not surprising really. Cast iron head. Now, Austin 10 cylinder heads ordinarily in production times were made from aluminium, but this being a wartime build meant that aluminium was in short supply and needed for the aircraft industry, and so they've used cast iron, a cheaper and more plentiful material, to actually build this from. Let's get the dynamo bracket off. Now this engine is what's known as a side valve engine, which means the valves are literally at the side of the cylinders, and this is a really inefficient engine, although pretty reliable. A little bit of shock, not too much ore. There we go. There's the inlet and exhaust manifold off, all one piece. You can see the ports that go into the side of the engine there. Right, so I'm now ready to take the cylinder head off, give it a little bit of a shock, just to loosen it off. I can see a bit of movement, making sure that I'm using a copper faced hammer rather than a cast hammer, because otherwise cast and cast shatters. Right, so there we go, just coming off. Right, this is the cylinder head, but unlike modern engines, which normally have the valve gear either coming down from the top with an overhead cam or with rockers, this is just essentially a flat plate with shapes in there, scallops in there, and these are the actual combustion chambers here. So it's called a side valve engine, and that's because the valves actually operate to the side of the cylinders. It's a really ancient and inefficient method, because what happens is the fuel and air mixture goes in, it then comes up through the valves, gets burnt in the combustion chamber, and then it has to go back out and down through the exhaust and out that way. So that means that the gas flow is really, really inefficient. So it's always trying to work against itself to get the actual gas flow happening. On modern engines, the valves would come from overhead, so they'd be in here. That would allow the petrol and air mixture to go in the one side, be burnt in the combustion chamber, then out the other side really efficiently. Right, let's just have a little look to see what's going on in these bores. The bores hardly seem to be worn at all. I'm just wondering if there's any markings on the top to indicate that it's had new pistons and been rebored. Let's just have a look. I can see some marks on there. Yeah, it says 30 S, which means 30 thousandths of an inch over size. So at some point this engine has actually been rebuilt, which is great news. So come on, Don, you're the engine man. We used to work on the buses together.
Oh yes, yeah, a long time ago.
That's right. But, yeah, exactly. Well, not so very long for me. Thanks very much. You know, I'm not as old, really.
Thank you very much.
So,
but yes, an engine's an engine. To be fair, but it's just
true.
The construction and everything else that goes with it. But these cylinders they're rather good actually.
Yeah, exactly. And the valves themselves, they look, well, like a reasonable colour, really, like an engine that's been in fairly good tune. Older engines quite often have big sooty deposits on them.
Yeah, I would say possibly that's the use of modern fuels.
Yeah, nobody decokes an engine now. With modern additives, fuels are really clean. They burn cleanly inside the engine, which means you don't get all these deposits. Unless, of course, you add some sort of little snake oil or something like that, then you start to build up deposits again.
Absolutely.
Right, so here we have the head gasket. Now, often people say, my head gasket's gone on my engine. Now, a head gasket is simply a seal between two mating surfaces, in this case, the block and the cylinder head. And this just takes out a load of the imperfections, because there are always slight little imperfections in cast iron heads. Even though they're skimmed nice and flat, there's a little grain to them, a bit like wooden grain, I suppose, in that way. And this just takes out all of those imperfections. You can just see the little indentations there, and that means that it's got a perfect gas and also liquid seal. So I'm happy with what I've seen on the top here. Should we spin it over?
Let's go for it.
Let's have a look at the bottom.
I think so.
Okay, we're ready. There might be a bit of oil come out of this.
A bit of water as well,
yeah.
maybe.
And let's see what we've got. Okay, so we've got another gasket there. Again, a seal between the two imperfect surfaces. Bit of sludge in the bottom, but I'd expect that.
Mate, dear me.
Oh, actually, this doesn't seem... I've seen worse. I can see the camshaft here, and actually, from what I can see, the cams themselves look in pretty good shape. Well, looking at the underside of the pistons now, they are absolutely spotlessly clean. Fantastic news. But here is the area that I've been worried about. Now, we've got a little bit of cork there, and then the actual rear crankshaft seal is held in place by this rear bearing cap.
This is going to be interesting, you know, because we know it's been rebored.
Yeah.
New pistons, etc.
Yeah.
But the age of the split pins tells us that the crank may not have been removed.
Yeah.
So I wonder what these bearings are going to reveal.
Yeah. Okay, so here's number 2 cap off, and actually it does have lock tabs in. So that's a really very early version.
It is.
Of an engine with separate bearing shells, and actually those are not in the best condition.
No, unfortunately there's a nasty pickup through the centre. Yeah. And on the outside it's starting to actually break away the white metal surface. Now,
that's right.
Is that through ill fitting, or do we have a crankshaft problem?
The crank itself doesn't feel too bad, and I think it's probably through ill fitting and likely through dirty fitting.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
But there's one thing. Here is the rear main bearing cap. And what can you see there?
No seal, matey.
No seal.
He's caught us out.
Yeah, that's right. So in fact, what I can actually see though is a slight bit of wear on this end cap here. Now, at the end of this crankshaft, there is indeed an Archimedes scroll. Now, this was the extra option that we didn't actually mention, that this could just be a plain Archimedes screw on the back of the engine, and that's indeed what it is. So it depends on this crankshaft being perfectly centered. If it's not perfectly centered, it can drop down into the engine a little bit, which means that oil can seep past the screw. If this is perfectly centered, then oil will actually get thrown back by the screw. Now, if this scroll or the crankshaft is correctly centered with new fresh bearings, then it won't move about anywhere, which means that it won't chatter against this edge, and that means that the oil won't leak past it. So that is what the problem was.
In the meantime,
Cup of tea?
Well said, mate.
Come on then.